Gaming, as we know, has become huge business in the past decade or so, but nowhere has there been more explosive growth than in gaming apps we download on our tablets and smartphones. Now, the business financing firm Pollen VC has been taking a look at a growth area within that expansion, namely the ability for smaller, perhaps often more independent games developers to start cutting out the middlemen and publish their own games direct to these apps, and ask what that means for the industry. Martin Macmillan is the CEO and co-founder of Pollen VC.
Traditional games publishing is much more around sort of console and PC games, if you like. So if you wind the clock back maybe 15 years or so, what would typically happen is that the publishers would hook up with game developers. They'd provide them an advance in order to actually build out a game. And then they would arrange all the kind of commercial aspects, specifically things like the printing of packaging, CD-ROMs, physical distribution to get them into bricks and mortar stores all over the world. And then they would do a revenue share after the recoup had been advanced, very much as if it was like a music publishing or a book publishing deal. So that's really how it was. And then if you fast forward to today, really what's happened is with the advent of the app stores, there's a much greater sort of level of democratization in terms of they basically open it up so anyone can be an app publisher or a games publisher. What that has meant is that the bar is substantially lower. And that's one of the things that's led to this massive proliferation of much, much smaller studios and individuals basically being able to publish their games and their apps on the App Store.
I want to get into some of the more detailed hows and whys in a moment, but at its most basic level, is it a fact as well that the way that we consume games has changed so that you don't have to have as much stuff that goes around a game? You just have to sort of develop a game and it can be on a platform. You don't have to have packaging on a disc or a cartridge, any kind of distribution network. Has that opened these sort of floodgates that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key things, and also the development cycles. Depending on the genre of game, the development cycles can be incredibly short. So if you look at the hyper casual genre, for example, that's huge on mobile just now, these games can be developed as quickly as within a few days to a week. So very, very rapid development cycles. You're not talking about multi-year, enormous teams at all. They can be done with very, very small teams and reach market very, very quickly. So everything is happening quicker, basically.
And you touched on just an explosion of deals. Your research at Pollen has said you're knocking on the door of $7 billion, $6.73 billion worth of deals in the sector going on right now. What is driving that?
We looked at the data that had been published by InvestGame, which basically said, there's $6.7 billion of M&A activity in mobile gaming since the beginning of 2020. And what we wanted to do is to dig into that and to figure out what the primary business model of the types of studios that were being acquired were. The results from that in terms of the studios whose primary business model was to self-publish their games took 83% of the deal value, 15% was publishers themselves, and there were only 2% that were studios who worked through a third-party publisher in order to get their games to market. So we think that sends a really, really strong signal to founders. If they're wanting to ultimately grow something that is valuable enough to be acquired, then the self-publishing route is super important.
Well, I'm interested in that idea of if you're starting out now, anywhere in the world, wanting to develop games, sell them on apps. I wondered what sort of things you think are key to that.
I think it's really a case of thinking really, really early on, what sort of studio do you want to be and what do you want to be remembered for? And there are lots and lots of developers in the world who are fantastic at game development, very focused on their products and making great games, that don't necessarily want to go through all of the hassles of raising lots of rounds of additional capital or are necessarily trying to build something they can sell. They just love making great games. In which case, there are some great publishers out there, and that can be a very, very effective route for them. It's really just, I think, this idea of as early on in the studio's life cycle, think about what you want to be doing and what sort of path you're going to seek. It is definitely a much more difficult and higher risk path if you're going to build a studio that self-publishes its own games. But what we see is this big trend now from people in the space going from game developers to being in the games business, and self-publishing is a real key part of being in the games business.
Martin Macmillan of Pollen VC.